50 years ago, a group of self-described revolutionaries did something that shocked the world. In just 2 years, they declared war on America, assassinated a beloved school superintendent, robbed several banks, bombed several police cars, murdered an innocent bystander, kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst, and convinced her to join their cause. Before most of the group burned to death in a fiery shootout in Los Angeles, right on live television. This webcast is about everything that made that story possible, and almost none of it is what I expected to find when I started looking. I came to this project with a set of beliefs about the Symbionese Liberation Army and the era that produced them. I had to dismantle most of those beliefs before I could tell this story honestly. This is the story of who the SLA really were, what they actually believed, and what it tells us about a nation that is still grappling with the same failures that produced them. This is House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution.
Patricia had worked through each member of the group individually, made her case, answered their questions, convinced them one by one that she belonged here, that she was serious, that she was not going back. Tico had been the hardest. He tried to talk her out of it, not because he had anything against her personally, but because he was practical enough to understand that her presence made the group a target in a way that her absence would not. She assured him her old life was gone. Her mother, her father, her fiancé, all of it. Gone or finished or something she could not return to. Eventually, Tico said yes. They all said yes. She was 20 years old, and she had just solved one problem and created several others. The FBI was not going to stop looking for her. Was, if anything, going to look harder, with a different legal framework and a different public mandate once the communique and taped recording was released, declaring herself a willing member of the organization that had kidnapped her. Her family was not going to stop being her family. The world she had come from was not going to stop existing simply because she had announced that she had left it. What she felt about all of this in the days after the vote is not something the record fully captures. What the record shows is that she trained. She did the calisthenics and cleaned the weapons and participated in the drills. She wore the charm. She was Tania now. But Robin Steiner, the woman who had been Tania until before the Foster assassination, had fled back to Florida. An Oakland police detective had flown to Florida to interview her, to ask who had provided the cyanide used in the bullets that killed Marcus Foster. Steiner only told investigators that she had kept the SLA financially solvent through stealing, forgery, and shoplifting, bringing in as much as $2,000 a week at her peak, but that she escaped when she saw that the group was planning to kill someone. 4 days before the kidnapping of Hearst, Donald DeFries called Steiner at her parents' home in Florida. He told her the SLA's biggest action was coming and tried to draw her back into the organization. She declined. SYNCU later issued a death warrant against her. On April 4th, KPFA received an audio tape recorded by Russell Little and Joe Ramiro from inside prison. They were asking the SLA's War Council to rescind the death threat against Robin, with Ramiro insisting on the recording that she had repeatedly refused to speak to the FBI. Patricia overheard someone relay this to DeFries. His response was immediate. Both Little and Ramiro, he said, deserved death warrants of their own for the crime of allowing themselves to be captured. Patricia, Tania, had slowly begun to know each of the comrades from the night she was abducted when, terrified, Tico had reached into the trunk of the car and held her hand, to the nasal, commanding sound of Sinkyu's voice who informed her she was a prisoner of war, to those tenuous blind steps to the bathroom aided by Jelena, who acted like she was part of the weirdest slumber party, gushing about the man she loved, to the sound of Kajo reading the words of the revolution to her, to Faiza, Yolanda, Zoya, each adding their own voices to the chamber, angry and strident and fierce and even suspicious. But there was one more voice, one more presence there in the house. Gabi was the SLA name of Camilla Hall, Zoya's former lover. She only joined the Symbionese Liberation Army just before Tania was taken. Gabi occupied a particular and lonely place within the group. To the FBI, she was barely a name. That failure of attention gave her a freedom of movement that none of the others could safely risk. She could walk into a grocery store, move through the city without setting off the surveillance net that was, by this point, tightening around everyone else in the house. She handled the logistics that kept an underground organization fed and supplied in an expensive city. It looked like usefulness. It also kept her at the edges of the group rather than inside it. Present, needed, maybe even used. Camilla and Patricia Soltysik had been neighbors first, in an apartment building on Channing Way in Berkeley, after Camilla arrived in the city in 1971. Before Berkeley, she had spent a year in the Los Angeles area trying to make something of herself as an artist. Berkeley gave her a community of poets and painters, a small gallery willing to sell her drawings, a women's publication willing to print her poems, a job tending a small public park. She was gay, and for the first time in her life, she was somewhere that let her be gay openly. Some of what she wrote in that period reveals the unguarded joy of a person who has spent years carrying a secret and has finally been allowed to set it down. But this turn toward women and toward Berkeley as a place to live an open life was not a straightforward awakening. It was during her time as a social worker back in Minnesota that she first began to question her relationships with men. For a while, she kept dating them anyway, including Black men. She seemed to be testing herself against a string of relationships that never quite met her emotional needs. Underneath it all sat a persistent insecurity that men might like her well enough without ever finding her beautiful. When she did turn toward women, it was less a sudden discovery than a conscious decision, made deliberately rather than fallen into. Around the same time, she became a vegetarian and quit smoking, another act of self-remaking undertaken on purpose. Patricia Soltysik was sharp, intense, and already moving toward the politics that would eventually consume her entirely. Camilla followed. She had also grown more deeply immersed in the creative and feminist circles closing in around her, to the point that, in the curious arithmetic of that period of her life, she actually grew less conventionally political. She didn't even vote in 1972. The relationship with Ms. Moon, as she had named her lover in one poem, was the current pulling her forward. The world events of the moment barely registered. She always followed Ms. Moon's gravity more than Ms. Moon followed hers. That imbalance would define everything that came after. But the imbalance in Camilla's life came long before. Camilla Christine Hall was the surviving child of a family that had buried 3 others. Her father was a Lutheran minister doing mission work in Africa at times, a household organized around sacrifice and service to people outside the family rather than need within it. First, her brother Terry died of heart disease when Camilla was just 3 years old. Then her brother Peter, 3 years later. Both Peter and her younger sister Nan had congenital kidney disease. Nan lingered longer than the others. Nan was needy and charming and attention-seeking in ways that left little room for anyone else. Camilla never behaved as though she resented any of it, but she later admitted to a friend that she'd been jealous of her sister. She was 17 when Nan died. The day before, she had been voted senior class clown. Class clowns are very often compensating for something. Camilla had a great deal to compensate for. 3 dead siblings, years of a household built around illness and loss, and a queerness she hadn't yet been able to face. In college, she cared less about grades than about simply expanding what she understood about the world, and she threw herself into anti-war organizing on campus. Friends there nicknamed her Mother Mill for the way she nurtured everyone around her without being asked to. She was a poet, a visual artist, even a musician. She wrote a song for a local foster care recruitment program that aired on television after she graduated. As a social worker after graduation, pregnant teenagers were her weak point. She got too attached, cared too visibly, chafed constantly against the procedures. She was nearsighted and wore glasses her entire life. Her weight was always an issue. And the shadow of her siblings' illnesses weighed on her. So in 1973, when she developed her own kidney troubles, she was afraid. She didn't trust conventional medicine and leaned instead on herbal and natural treatments. And she didn't tell her parents until she went home to Chicago that Christmas. She hadn't wanted to alarm them, not after everything they had already lost. That visit was, by her family's account, a normal and even tender one. She helped her mother with the houseplants. She asked to see old home movies, including footage from the only Christmas all the children had ever spent together. But she also spoke about an economic depression she expected. On the drive to the airport, she told them how serious she believed the situation in the country had become. It was the last time her parents saw her alive. None of that, on its own, explains how this gentle, giving poet, a woman so sensitive that she would move snails from her garden by hand to a nearby park, wound up becoming a radical fugitive from justice. What explains it is Ms. Moon, Zoya, Pat Soltysik, the pull of a love that was never returned with equal weight, and a willingness shaped by a childhood in which Camilla's own needs had always come second, to keep giving without expecting much back. Patricia Hearst, who was not given to sentimentality about her captors, would later describe Gabi with something closer to genuine feeling than she extended to almost anyone else in that house. Gabi, she wrote, was the most sensitive person in the group. In a house full of people performing revolutionary hardness, she was the one who never quite learned how to embody it. Hearst reached for an image from a children's game to describe Hall, the cheese that stands alone at the end of the farmer in the dell. Nobody wanted her. Not really. They wanted her service, but not her. Gabi did not live with the SLA until the time that Patricia Hearst was abducted. As the kidnapping was planned, she became needed at the safe house, the one person who could run errands undetected, slipping in and out and feeling appreciated more than she actually was. Still, she resisted moving in until Patty was in the closet. She gave her cat away to neighbors, one last small act of consideration before she went underground. By the spring of 1974, Gabi had already given the SLA nearly everything she had. On March 1st, she had gone to her bank in Berkeley and withdrawn the last of her savings, just over $1,500, and handed it to the organization. 3 days later, she sold her Volkswagen to a local dealer. The dealer sold it to a clerical worker in the FBI's San Francisco office. The car sat in the bureau's parking lot for weeks before they recognized it. The FBI knew Camilla Hall was affiliated with the SLA. They had not watched her bank account closely enough. They had not tracked the vehicle sale. This oversight gave her a freedom of movement that the more visible members of the organization could not safely exercise. She was Gabi, the errand girl, the cheese that stands alone. Q announced it was time to announce Tania to the world. First, he wanted to stage a photo op, and he requested that someone create a backdrop with the 7-headed cobra. The women cut the shape from black felt and stitched it onto a red blanket. They hung it on the wall. Then Zoya got the Polaroid camera. The photographs she took that day are among the most reproduced images in American criminal history. Tania, in a beret, standing in front of the Cobra flag, holding the M1 carbine. The photographs were not released immediately. They were held, ready to be deployed at the moment that would give them maximum impact. That moment was coming. Tania sat down with Faiza, reviewing notes over and over until she was ready to record her statement. After the recording, Zoya and Faiza also cut Patricia's hair. Every snip was like part of Patricia Campbell Hearst falling away. On April 1st, Faiza went to a florist in disguise and arranged for a bouquet to be delivered that day to the editor of a San Francisco underground newspaper. Inside the envelope accompanying the flowers was a brief communique suggesting that within 72 hours, the SLA would announce Patricia Hearst's release. April Fool's Day. The communique was the joke. The florist's truck broke down. The bouquet arrived a day late on April 2nd, which disrupted the prank's timing without changing its essential cruelty. The Hearst family believed it. Patricia's sister moved out of her bedroom to prepare for a homecoming. The family cook made matzo ball soup, Patricia's favorite. The following day, a tape arrived at KSAN radio. She addressed her parents. The pin food giveaway had been a fraud, she said, an attempt to deceive the people while the FBI used the time to plan her execution. She turned to Stephen Weed. There was no neutrality in a time of war, she told him. She had changed, grown, become conscious that she could never return to the life they had shared. Her love had not diminished, she said, it had expanded to embrace all people, to include her comrades in a way her old life had not prepared her for. Then she came to the center of what she had to say.
I've been given the choice of 1, being released in a safe area, or 2, joining the forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army and fighting for my freedom and the freedom of all oppressed people. I have chosen to stay and fight. I have been given the name Tania after a comrade who fought alongside Che in Bolivia for the people of Bolivia. I embrace the name with the determination to continue fighting with her spirit. It is in the spirit of Tania that I say, Patria o muerte, venceremos.
That message was heard around the world. The responses were that of shock and dismay, but notably, none of the radical groups, the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, issued a public statement, which was tactically smart on their part, frankly. Any organization that responded publicly was being asked to take a position on whether a kidnapped heiress had genuinely converted to revolutionary politics. And every available answer was politically treacherous. Endorsing it meant endorsing the coercion of a young woman and the SLA's claim that kidnapping produced authentic radicalization. Condemning it meant either defending the Hearst establishment or attacking the SLA's methods in terms that the FBI and mainstream press would immediately use against the broader left. At the Hearst family home in Hillsborough, Catherine listened to her daughter's voice coming through a speaker and told a friend she believed Patricia was already dead, that whoever was speaking on this tape had replaced her daughter, that the person she had raised was gone. Randy Hearst said nothing publicly that captured what he felt. He had spent 2 months and more than $2 million trying to keep his daughter alive. He had organized a food distribution program under revolutionary duress and watched it descend into chaos in parking lots. He had listened to FBI agents tell him night after night that they were making progress, and he had understood night after night that they were not. And now his daughter's voice was on a radio station telling the world she had chosen to join her captors. The Symbionese Liberation Army needed money. The PIN program was over. The ransom demand had produced food for others rather than cash. The operational costs of keeping 9 people housed and armed and fed in San Francisco were significant and ongoing, and the SLA's finances were precarious. But money was not the only factor. The propaganda value of Tania's first public action as a full member of the SLA was, in Sin's strategic thinking, potentially as important as the cash itself. A tape was one thing. A communique was one thing. Tania, standing inside a San Francisco bank with a weapon in her hands, documented by a security camera, was something the manifesto and the Cobra flag and all the communiques in the world could not replicate. It was proof of a different order entirely. Jelena and Tico identified the branch, the Hibernia Bank in the Sunset District, where Bo had grown up, between Golden Gate Park and the Pacific. Between April 11th and 13th, 2 members of the group used false identification to rent the 4 vehicles the operation would require. On the night before the robbery, Sing-Q ordered steak and potatoes for everyone. A splurge, he said. The SLA's finances were about to be refreshed. April 15, 1974 was a Monday morning in the Sunset District of San Francisco. The inside team left the apartment on Golden Gate Avenue in a car driven by Gabi, who took a route that wound through Golden Gate Park. Tania had not been out of doors really since she had been taken weeks before. When the car moved through the park and she saw grass and trees, she came close to weeping. Then the fear arrived alongside the beauty, or underneath it, or woven through it. She was terrified and electrified in equal measure. Gabi stopped the car around the corner from the bank. The outside team had parked across Noriega Street, positioned to cover the exit. At 9:51 in the morning, Gabi opened the door to the Hibernia Bank branch and held it, and Sin, Tania, Faiza, and Zoya walked inside. There were 18 employees and 6 customers in the branch when they entered. Faiza, moving through the door, dropped her ammunition clip. It hit the floor with a loud clatter. She stooped immediately, gathering the bullets, and Sing-Q stepped over her without breaking stride and addressed the room. This is a holdup. The first motherfucker who don't lay down on the floor gets shot in the head. People went down. Faiza recovered her ammunition, got to her feet, and began moving through the prone bodies on the floor toward the teller stations, shouting, SLA, SLA, SLA. Zoya vaulted over the partition separating the customer area from the tellers and began moving through the drawers. Sin positioned himself by the front door and found the bank's security guard, removing the man's .38 caliber revolver from his holster with stunning efficiency. On the second floor in the break room, the branch manager heard the commotion below and punched the silent alarm at 9:51 a.m. 2 high-speed cameras with wide-angle lenses activated, capturing 4 frames per second. Tania took her position in direct view of the security cameras. That was her assignment, to be seen, to be documented, to provide the visual evidence that the photographs taken in the apartment had been designed to anticipate. She wore a dark shag wig and a navy peacoat. She reached for the bolt of her M1 carbine to fire a warning shot at the ceiling. The bolt jammed. In the chaos and the adrenaline and the terror of a first robbery with a malfunctioning weapon, she improvised. This is Tania, Patricia Hearst, she said. Then she recovered. The carbine unjammed, or she set aside the plan to fire it. She joined the others in commanding the people on the floor not to move. First person puts up his head, she said, I'll blow his motherfucking head off. Everything was proceeding as planned until 2 new customers walked in off the street. Pete Markoff owned a liquor store. Gene Brennan was a retired pensioner. They came through the door of the Hibernia Bank that Monday morning and walked into the middle of an armed robbery. Faiza reacted. She opened fire. Her aim, consistent with her performance at the Foster assassination, was not precise. Markov was hit in the buttocks. Brennan was hit in the hand. Both men made it back through the door and onto the sidewalk, bleeding but alive. The robbery concluded. The take was $10,660, split from the teller drawers. Sin had the security guard's revolver. The team moved out. The car was waiting. The getaway was clean. No arrests, no pursuit that caught them. The group dissolved back into San Francisco and made their way to the apartment, where Sin counted the money and parceled it into individual shares of roughly $1,000 each. One for every member, including Tania. His reasoning was operational. If police raided the apartment, he wanted everyone to have sufficient funds to scatter and regroup. Each person walked away from that table with their share in their pocket. The security guard's revolver was the trophy. DeFries presented it to Tania with a nearly ceremonial flourish. This is for you, Tania, your personal sidearm. Keep it on your person at all times and learn how to use it. The cameras on the second floor of the Hibernia Bank branch had been running at 4 frames per second from 9:51 a.m. until the SLA left. What they produced was a sequence of images that would be on the front page of every newspaper in the country the following morning, and that would define the public understanding of Patricia Hearst for the next 50 years. The images showed a young woman in a dark wig and a dark coat holding a carbine, standing in a position of apparent command over the people on the floor around her. She was not cowering. She was not visibly distressed. She was giving orders, and her posture was that of someone who appeared to have made a decision and was acting on it. What the images showed was real. The posture was real. The weapon was real. The orders were real. The voice that said she was Tania and Patricia Hearst was real, recorded by the same security system that captured her image. What the images did not show was the 10 weeks that preceded them, including the 59 days that Patty spent as a captive. They did not show the closet or the darkness or the voices through the door or the progression by which a person's prior identity is eroded and replaced by the only identity available in a closed environment. They did not show the human entanglement of captivity and dependency. They did not show any of the conditions that had produced the person standing in front of those cameras. The cameras showed what cameras show, the surface of a moment, without the history that created it. A country that had been following the story for 2 months looked at the images and made a decision. The decision was swift and it was nearly unanimous, and it was, in the way that simple explanations are always more appealing than complicated ones, deeply satisfying. She had chosen this. She could have run. She could have screamed. She could have told the people on the floor to get up, told them to call the police, walked out the door. She had not. She had stood in front of a security camera and said her name was Tania. But look closely at the security camera frames and you'll find something in the public reaction mostly glossed over. The FBI's own lead investigator stated publicly that SLA members were photographed pointing guns at Hearst during the robbery. Time magazine, analyzing the same images within days of the robbery, identified a frame showing both Sin-Q and Gabi with their rifles aimed not at bank customers or guards, but toward Tania, and characterized it plainly as what it appeared to be, making sure she played her part. The cameras had documented it. The country had decided what it meant. There really was no nuance as far as the public understood. The security camera photographs were published the morning after the robbery, and the country made up its mind before lunch. Heiress turned terrorist. The narrative was simple and it was everywhere. A young woman from one of the wealthiest families in America had been kidnapped by radicals, spent 2 months in their custody, and emerged holding a weapon and shouting her new name at people on the floor of a San Francisco bank. What more was there to understand? This was April 1974. The country was 9 months into the Watergate unraveling that would end a presidency. It was a year past the formal end of American involvement in Vietnam and several years into the moral exhaustion of having been lied to about that war by multiple administrations across a decade. The public appetite for complexity was not high. Public appetite for a story with a clear meaning, a story that did not require anyone to sit with ambiguity or reconsider comfortable assumptions about how people work, was considerable. The Hearst photographs provided that story. The country consumed it. But the question was raised, was Tania's conversion legit or had she been brainwashed? The one person who seemed to raise that specter the most was Stephen Weed. In early April, he began reaching out through radical exile networks, exploring whether any country might be willing to grant asylum to the SLA in exchange for Patricia's release. One contact suggested that Regis Debray, the Marxist theoretician whose work on guerrilla strategy had been found in the SLA's Concord safe house, and who had personally known the original Tania, might be willing to mediate. Joan Baez, a mutual acquaintance, agreed to make contact. Debray expressed some interest. Stephen flew to Mexico City, and days later, Debray issued a public statement, not in assent or dissent, simply concerned that a woman who was not in command of anything in her life had chosen the name of a very brave woman he had known who died of the cause. The United States Attorney General William Saxby announced that Patricia Hearst had not been a reluctant participant in the robbery. She and her associates were, in his assessment, common criminals. California Attorney General Val Younger went further. He criticized the FBI for insufficient aggression in the pursuit of the SLA and delivered what amounted to a public verdict on Patricia before any legal proceeding had begun. The moment of truth, he said, had long since passed for Patricia Hearst. Randy and Catherine Hearst held a position that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. They could not embrace what their daughter appeared to have become, could not follow the Berkeley radicals who found in Tania a kind of perverse celebrity, and they could not accept the establishment's verdict that she was simply a criminal who had made her choices freely. They insisted she was still a victim. Saxby, Randy said publicly, was not in possession of all the facts. Whatever legal consequences Patricia might eventually face, her parents would be there for her. Randy sensed the ground shifting beneath that position. He said so privately. He knew that the photographs had changed something in the public's relationship to his daughter's story in a way that communiques and tapes had not. He kept his public stance, but he understood what it was costing. He was also still trying to use food as a lever. After the final pin distribution on March 25th, Peggy Mays and Ludlow Kramer returned to Seattle, exhausted, somewhat stunned by the month they had spent inside the most surreal logistical operation either of them had ever attempted. But Randy traveled to New York to persuade the Hearst Corporation to place $4 million in escrow for a future food distribution program to be released if Patricia was freed. He was still trying to buy his daughter back with groceries. He also had lunch with Russell Means and Dennis Banks of the American Indian Movement, hoping to leverage their community connections into information or influence. The two men, operating in their own complicated security environment, had their food tasted before they ate it. At the FBI's offices on Golden Gate Avenue, just over a mile from where the SLA was living, an agent named Monty Hall was running the day-to-day investigation. He had cleared nearly an acre of floor space from the Bureau's offices and filled it with agents working labor-intensive assignments. Recognizing that the SLA was moving between locations, Hall established a program to track and interview tenants who had recently signed new leases or applied for utility connections across the Bay Area. It produced nothing. He also learned that DeFries had a preference for plum wine, an unusual enough taste that it seemed like it might be traceable, and dispatched agents to liquor stores to identify regular purchasers. Plum wine, it turned out, was available in approximately 5,000 retail outlets across the Bay Area. That line of inquiry closed. Back at the apartment, Sing-Q treated Tania as a full comrade now, in every sense the organization's ideology made available. She and Kajou functioned as a couple within the strange domestic architecture of the SLA, where coupling was real but exclusivity was prohibited, and the group's collective needs superseded individual preference. They slept together, with Patty given deferential treatment with the Murphy bed, while everyone else slept on floor mattresses and sleeping bags. But they were also expected, as comrades, to be available to others. In this context, in the weeks after the robbery, Tania and Tico became physically involved as well. Tico had kept his deliberate distance from her for months, had refused to let her become a person to him, because he understood that the role she served was easier to manage if she stayed abstract. That distance had collapsed. On April 24th, another tape arrived. Tania's voice again, this time with the edge of someone who has absorbed an ideology and is deploying it rather than performing it. She addressed the bank robbery directly. Casualties could have been avoided, she said, if the people involved had stayed out of the way. She was alive and well. The idea that she had been brainwashed was, she said, ridiculous to the point of being beyond belief. Consciousness was terrifying to the ruling class, she continued, and they would do anything to discredit people who had come to understand that the only alternative to freedom was death. She turned her attention to Stephen Weed. She said she was amazed to think the first thing she would want if she were free was to see him. She did not care if she never saw him again. During the period of her captivity, he had revealed himself to be, in her words, a sexist, ageist pig. Frankly, she said, Stephen was the one who sounded brainwashed. Sing-Q added a postscript. Anyone who attempted to assist the enemy of the people during an SLA operation, he said, would be shot without hesitation. There was no middle ground in war. Either you were with the people or with the enemy. Sin had decided to go recruiting. The heat from the Hibernia robbery was making the Golden Gate Avenue apartment feel exposed. The FBI was closer than was comfortable. Rather than simply move and go quiet, Sing-Q developed a strategy that was either audacious or delusional or both. He would walk the streets of San Francisco and knock on doors and introduce himself. He went out 3 times in late April, accompanied by Tico and Jelena, carrying copies of Jehovah's Witness Watchtower magazine as cover for the canvassing. He looked for Black residents who appeared to him to have the right looks, politically aware, potentially sympathetic, and he followed them home and knocked. He told them who he was. He told them what the SLA was doing. He asked if they wanted to be part of it. The most remarkable thing about this campaign was that it produced results. Nobody called the police. One family, connected to the Nation of Islam, became a genuine ally. The young woman of the household, who called herself Jamelia, came to visit the Golden Gate apartment and brought a group with her, several adults and children. One of the visitors asked to meet Tania. Sing-Q pointed her out. The man said she didn't look like her pictures. Sin told Hearst to smile. People don't recognize you unless you smile, he said, like in your pictures. Another visitor looked around the apartment and asked where all the black members were. He could only see Sin Q. Sin told him this was the white unit. The black units were training elsewhere. He said it with the ease of a man who had been constructing explanations for the gap between his ideology and his reality for years. There were no other units. Over the following weeks, Sin Q supplied his new allies with cash to purchase 3 used vans. He asked them to find a new place to live, somewhere farther from the FBI's offices, less exposed. They located a 2-bedroom apartment in Hunters Point, another of the city's working-class neighborhoods, at 1808 Oakdale Avenue. When the SLA finished cleaning out the Golden Gate Avenue apartment, they left a message for whoever came looking. Into the bathtub, they poured a mixture of documents, keys, including the keys to the vehicles used in the Hibernia robbery, and a quantity of potassium cyanide crystals dissolved in water. On the bathroom wall, they wrote a warning directed at the FBI, the CIA, and several other agencies, noting the presence of the cyanide and wishing the investigators happy hunting. They addressed it to Charles Bates by name. They covered the other walls with graffiti. Among the writing, in the rounded hand of a private school education that no amount of revolutionary identity could entirely erase, was a message in Patricia Hearst's handwriting. Freedom is the will of life. Patria o muerte. Venceremos. Tania. The apartment on Oakdale Avenue in Hunters Point settled into a tense atmosphere. The Nation of Islam recruits brought food. The daily calisthenics continued. Sin Q ran the drills with intensity, keeping the group in constant motion, because motion meant purpose, and purpose meant not having to answer the questions that were accumulating in the corners of every room. What came next? What the plan was? What winning looked like for an organization of 9 people in an unfurnished apartment that the FBI was actively hunting. Patricia Mizmoon Soltysik, Zoya, was 23 years old in the spring of 1974. She had been the intellectual engine of the SLA from its earliest days in the Oakland apartment on East 17th Street, and she remained its most rigorous thinker even now. She was not warm in the way that Jelena was warm. Jelena could make the revolution feel like something worth belonging to. Zoya made it feel necessary. People gravitated toward Jelena's warmth for comfort. They needed Zoya's rigor to function. These are not the same as being loved. Tania was not close to her. Patricia Hearst said so directly later. Zoya had been the architect of the captivity, the woman who had researched coercive persuasion techniques, who had structured the information environment of the closet, who had chosen the reading material and helped design the conditions that produced Tania. She had built the closed room and then lived inside it alongside everyone else, carrying the burden of being the person who understood most clearly what it was and how it worked. But she had not sat with Tania, reading to her. She had not brushed her hair out after baths. What Zoya felt about her situation in the spring of 1974 is not documented. She left fewer personal traces than the others. What survives is the work, the documents, the theoretical writing, the evidence of a mind that had committed completely to a framework and was applying that framework with absolute consistency, even as the conditions around it deteriorated. Sin released a tape in this period in which he addressed his children by name.
At this point, I would like to take the opportunity to speak to my 6 lovely black babies. Victor, Damon, Sherry, Sherilyn, Dawn, and Dee Dee. I want you to know that to just say your names again fills my heart with joy. I want you to know that I love you all with all the love that a father can have for those so dear to him. And I want you to understand also that I have not forgotten my promise to you, that whenever you needed me, I would be there at your side. And so I am now, even when you may not see me, I am there. Because no matter where I am fighting for your freedom, your future, and your life. Daddy wants you to understand that I can't come home because you and the people are not free. And as long as the enemy exists, I can find no rest.
The gap between the General Field Marshal of the Symbionese Liberation Army and the man who had not seen his children in years was audible in every sentence. It was the most unguarded thing Donald DeFreeze had said publicly since the beginning of the SLA, and the grief in it was real, regardless of everything else. A young black Muslim woman named Ratima X had become one of the organization's regular visitors, recruited by Senkyu during his door-to-door campaign, now part of the network of allies who were bringing food and running logistical errands for the organization. What she found inside Oakdale Avenue reconfigured something in her. Black and white people living together, arguing together, conducting drills and eating meals, and treating each other as comrades in a way that her theology had told her was impossible. Baiza talked constantly about the necessity of multiracial unity and embraced Ratima every time she visited. The children of Ratima's household gave Senkyu a code name among themselves. They called him Jesus. He was pleased by this. The apartment on Golden Gate Avenue, the one the SLA abandoned several days before, had 6 locks on the door. An elderly blind woman named Lola Bell Evans lived in the building. She had not seen what happened in apartment 6, but she could hear it. They had been up at all hours, she said, making strange noises. Sometimes it sounded like heavy machinery being dragged across the floor, sometimes like drilling through it. The cockroaches had gotten bad in her own apartment, spreading from somewhere above. She complained to the building manager. The manager went to investigate. He found the 6 locks. When he finally got the door open, what he found inside prompted an immediate call to the police. The SLA had been gone for a week. The police who entered on May 2nd found a bathtub filled with documents, the keys to the vehicles used in the Hibernia robbery, and a quantity of potassium cyanide dissolved in water. On the bathroom wall was a message addressed to Charles Bates of the FBI by name, warning that the chemical solution in the tub was dangerous and wishing the investigators happy hunting. The other walls were covered in graffiti, the group's slogans, their names, their ideology rendered in marker and spray paint. Tico talked constantly, circling the same questions at volume. He had conceived the food giveaway, and it had given him a sense of contribution. That was over. The bank robbery had been planned by others. The recruitment campaign was Sin's. But Tico was a man whose energy had no adequate outlet and whose attention kept snagging on the gap between what the organization said it was doing and what it was actually doing. He wanted to know the next move. The conversations kept not producing one. Yolanda brought a different quality to the pressure. She was ferocious where Tico was restless, focused where he was scattered. She had committed to the confrontation the SLA was heading toward with a clarity that did not leave room for the kind of pragmatic hedging her husband kept reaching for. She had a political seriousness that the other members respected, and a volatility that everyone in the house felt, like how you sense changes in atmospheric pressure before a storm arrives. The Hunters Point apartment on Oakdale Avenue was smaller than Golden Gate had been, and the group was no smaller. 9 people in 2 bedrooms, with whatever floor space and sleeping arrangements could be improvised. The daily drills continued. The calisthenics continued. Senkyu pushed the physical training with an escalating intensity that was beginning to feel less like military preparation and more like the only available response to a pressure that had no other outlet. He was drinking more. One evening, the plum wine loosening the ideological performance he maintained during the daylight hours, he announced to the room that he was a prophet. He was on earth, he said, to lead the people. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Only silence followed. And then one day, DeFries made another announcement. They were going to Los Angeles. Late on the night of May 8th, the caravan left the Bay Area. They staggered their departure to avoid drawing attention. 3 vehicles, 3 passengers each. Separate departure times, all taking the same route south. Not the interstate, not the obvious highway that connects Northern and Southern California in the most direct line. They took Route 99 instead, the older road that runs through the agricultural interior of the state, through the Central Valley, through the towns that the freeway had bypassed and left to their own slow rhythms. They drove through the night, carefully observing the speed limits. They could not afford to be stopped for anything. Tico took the first shift at the wheel of a battered Chevrolet van. Yolanda sat beside him, her jaw set, her eyes carefully watching all around. Tania was in the back, next to a collection of weapons covered by a blanket. Before dawn, Tico pulled over and Yolanda took the wheel. Eventually, Tania drove too. The farms and orchards of the Central Valley moved past in the dark outside the windows. Then the sprawl of Los Angeles began to announce itself. The way that city announces itself from a distance, the glow of it on the horizon before anything is visible. They had left the only place any of them had any network, any support, any connection to the world that had produced them. They were driving toward a city where they had none of those things. Remember, Los Angeles was not where Senkyu was from. He had passed through it, had been arrested there, had run his gun operation in its neighborhoods. His family was no longer there, however. His associates were gone. LA was not a place where anyone in the organization had relationships that mattered, contacts that could be trusted, infrastructure that had been built and tested. It was, in every practical sense, foreign territory. Nobody said this out loud, however. Osceola and Bo were still in San Quentin. They had been there for 4 months, despite the efforts to leverage their release. The organization that had kidnapped Patricia Hearst to free them had not freed them, and it was no longer clear that freeing them was something anyone in the caravan was actively planning toward. The Symbionese Liberation Army drove south through the California night, through the darkness and the slow gathering light toward a city that was not waiting for them and did not know they were coming.
Thank you for listening to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. This is H. Allegra Lansing. This is a story about a country at war with itself, and about what happens when a generation's fury collapses into the worst possible reaction. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not fail because the injustice they saw wasn't real. They failed because they chose violence. And violence is the one form of resistance that entrenched power already knows how to defeat. It has been defeating it for centuries. Everyone swept up in the movement would pay a cost beyond measure, even an heiress to the nation's most powerful media empire. On the next episode of House on Fire, the Symbionese Liberation Army arrives in Los Angeles with no network, no allies, and no plan. They settle into a poor black neighborhood where 9 armed people, mostly white, cannot stay invisible for long. What follows is a cascade of events set in motion by something as small and stupid as a shoplifting incident, and it ends with more than 200 law enforcement officers, 5,000 rounds of ammunition, and a house burning to the ground on live television. The country watches 6 people die. Patricia Hearst watches from a distance, and when the smoke clears, she will face a version of the same choice she has already made once before, though this time nobody is holding a gun to her head. This webcast is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research, all writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Red Shift by The Grey Room with Density and Time. Additional audio recordings by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army.